In this presentation, we will learn about English language learners who have been misplaced in special education and the reasons for that.
Hello everyone, my name is Susana Torres and I'll be talking about the placement of English language learners in special education. So to start with, there has been a high percentage of English language learners who are being classified in special education or with learning disabilities, and one of the reasons why this is taking place is because sometimes educators have a difficult time distinguishing students who truly have special education and who truly need special education and students who are learning a second language are going through challenges and difficulties in the process. And so why are these students being placed in special education? So, like I mentioned, sometimes it might seem like the student is not making good academic progress in comparison to their peers, or they're not learning the language rapidly, so therefore they are referred for special education evaluation, and they are placed into special education when in reality some of these kids are just going through a process of learning a second language and facing the challenges that go with it. In our book, it's mentioned that 13% of the students are in programs serving students with disabilities or learning disabilities, and these statistics are according to the National Center for Education that were given in the year of 2016. And within these statistics, we can see that there's 21% of the students were identified as having speech or language impairment. And I have a question for you all. Can you guys think of any other reason why ESL students are being placed in special education? And what are some of the consequences that you guys can think of as a result of them being placed into special education when in reality they don't need it?
Hello, I'm Janelli, and I'm going to talk about assessment. Below are a list of reasons why English language learners would be assessed for special education. Starting off with oral language related problems, reading problems, written language problems, unable to understand or follow directions. However, when you don't know the language or are still learning the language, it is hard to say that you won't see this in English language learners. English language learner students more than often not participate in the class because while they may have the proficiency enough to answer the message, they may not have enough proficiency in English to answer. There is over-identification for special education, which results from assigning students to special education programs who do not actually need those services. That is why when bilingual children are being assessed, there are three different aspects of their development to keep in mind. First, language proficiency. Second, language proficiency. Third, the existence of a physical, learning, or behavioral difficulty. Materials and procedures used to assess a child with limited English proficiency must be selected and to ensure that they measure the extent to which the child has a disability and needs special education rather than measuring the child's English language skill. This approach enables an accurate and fair assessment to be made with regarding special education. All assessments contain some level of culture and or linguistic to reduce bias and the possible of over-identification of English language learners. All correct response in one or both language should be accepted during the assessment. Now, the question I have for you all is, what challenges do educators face while assessing English language learners?
Complications of diagnosing disabilities. Most disabilities and impairments that qualify a student to be put in special education include language impairment, autism, dyslexia, developmental aphasia, cognitive impairments, emotional disturbances, and behavioral problems. Many bilinguals are misidentified to have speech or language impairments. In a study by Mercer in 1973, researchers found that Mexican Americans were 10 times more likely to be in special education than white Americans. Underrepresentation also occurs in smaller districts with a small amount of English language learners due to a fear of misdiagnosis. My question is, what percentage of English language learners actually have a learning disability? As seen in the graph over here, common learning disabilities in California, the highest learning disability is speech or language impairment. Many schools have speech pathologists and speech programs, and many English learners get placed in the special education program because they are thought to have a language impairment, when actually they may just have a language delay because they are learning English and they are also learning their second language at the same time, and so they may have a delay in both languages as they are working very hard to meet the standards of their school. And thus, the most efficient way to place English learners in special education is to have a separate bilingual special education program. If they do indeed have a learning disability and they need that extra help, then they can have their bilingual education along with their special education and not be confused and overrepresented or underrepresented and placed in the right classrooms.
I am Joash Hicks, and I'm going to be talking about issues with funding. For English language learners, Title III is a part of the Every Student Succeeds Act, and it provides funding for ELLs. It's up to the state and local agencies to disperse these funds. Most of the funding for ELLs comes from state and local services, because the federal education funds only account for 11% of ELL spending. In 2015, 4 states did not even provide funding for ELLs. And once you're tested fluent English proficient, the funding is withdrawn. As opposed, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act provides funding for students with disabilities. In 2014, federal IDEA grants paid for $1,743 per student with disabilities. That's about 14.5% of general education students. That's a lot more money spent on students with disabilities than English language learners. Also, once diagnosed with the disability, it's permanent. Therefore, your funding doesn't get revoked. I'm going to leave you today with this question. Should funding for ELLs extend after they test fluent English proficient?
One of the issues facing English learners is that they are overrepresented in special education. One of the factors affecting this overrepresentation is the difficulty educators have distinguishing students who truly have special education needs from students who are learning English as a second language. To circumvent this factor, I suggest the following techniques, which mainly have to do with how we actually assess students. First, students need to be assessed in their strongest language. This means that the tests used cannot be simple translations from English, but developed in parallel so they are just as valid as the English language tests. This also may mean providing bilingual tests so that bilingual students can pull from their full linguistic range to adequately answer the assessment. Second, qualified interpreters may need to be present if the student doesn't speak any English or if the assessment cannot be provided in their strongest language. This may mean having an interpreter who is familiar with the specific dialect of the language the student uses to prevent any missed nuances. Third, qualified assessors must be used, and this means that they are not just simply qualified to administer the assessments, but are trained to use culturally valid instruments and procedures. Fourth, identification or placement of a student in special education should never just occur after one assessment. So it is important to use alternative and multiple measures of a student's abilities. This may mean providing informal and formal assessments several times or relying more on teacher observations from different settings. Fifth, assessors must learn to differentiate between normal second language development and actual learning disabilities. This can be resolved partly by relying on specialism in the assessment team who have been trained to differentiate this, and having these kinds of people actually on the team in the first place. An example would be to consider that weak auditory processing skills could indicate language acquisition issues rather than a cognitive learning disorder or processing disorder or learning disability. Lastly, the assessment team needs to pay greater attention to the socio-cultural context of the student. An English learner may be struggling because of cultural differences in their school, or the school is not actually providing resources in their first language, so the student is seen as failing. Quite often, a school may be failing to adequately support a student, which results in low performance on the student's end. So after considering these techniques, as a new teacher, how can you be an advocate for your English learners to be appropriately assessed?